This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Newbronner, and here are tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korea vows to take countermeasures in line with the growing level of military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. President Vladimir Putin hosts the leaders of the BRICS nations that make up more than a quarter of the world's economy in a high-profile summit to demonstrate the failure of Western attempts to isolate Russia. China carries out a live-firing exercise near Taiwan that Taipei says may be part of Beijing's so-called deterrence effect in the Taiwan Strait. A major overhaul of Asia-focused lender HSBC, its newly installed chief executive announcing a new leadership structure and a carve-up of its business units. Also on East Asia Tonight, South Korean Hyundai Motors India unit makes an unflattering debut. Shares drop more than 7% after a tepid response from retail investors to the country's largest initial public offering. And whales and dolphins washing up on Taiwan's shores in record numbers. We show you what's being done to rehabilitate and return them to the sea. But first, South Korea may consider directly supplying weapons to Ukraine as part of measures to counter military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. Seoul has accused Pyongyang of sending troops to fight for Moscow and is also considering sending personnel to Ukraine to monitor the North's troops.
정부는 북한군의 즉각적인 철수를 촉구하며 현재와 같은 북한과 러시아의 군사적 야합이 지속될 경우 이를 좌시하지 않고 국제사회와 함께 단호하게 대처해 나가기로 했습니다. 정부는 북한의 전투병력 파병에 따른 러북 군사협력의 진전 추이에 따라 단계적인 대응 조치를 실행해 나갈 것입니다.
South Korea's deputy national advisor says Pyongyang is acting like a criminal organization by sending young troops to fight for the Kremlin. Last week, Seoul's spy agency said the North had sent 1,500 special operations forces to support Moscow's war. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky backed that up, citing intelligence that reported 10,000 North Korean soldiers being prepared to join the Russian invasion. Kyiv released this video purportedly showing North Korean soldiers making preparations at a Russian military base. North Korea's UN representative dismisses the intelligence as groundless rumors. The Kremlin has neither confirmed nor denied this, but defended its cooperation with Pyongyang. Moscow says those ties are not directed against South Korea's security interests. Russia is hosting its biggest gathering of world leaders since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. President Vladimir Putin is staging the BRICS Summit in Kazan in what analysts say is a demonstration to the West that their mission to isolate Moscow has failed. The three-day summit is just getting started. Mr. Putin welcomed leaders from the founding nations of the bloc, including Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is their first summit since the group added new members, like Iran, earlier this year. More than 30 countries are now keen to join, and that's including Turkey, the first NATO member to express interest. Well, BRICS has been expanding as a counterweight to the West. The group was launched to bring together the world's emerging markets, but evolved to challenge the political and economic dominance of Western powers. It all started between Brazil, Russia, India, and China in 2006. A few years later, South Africa joined, making it BRICS with an S. Now, earlier this year, the group expanded to include countries like Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. The 9-member group makes up almost half of the world's population and more than a quarter of the global economy. And these figures suggest the group has come at least halfway towards becoming an alternative to prominent global bodies like the G7. The group of 7 rich democracies represent only 10% of the world population, but take up a little more than a quarter of global GDP. Now, BRICS members are promoting more use of national currencies in bilateral trade as one way of reshaping the US-led global order. But many hurdles remain as interests and incentives clash. Well, with more member countries joining, there are more areas of interest to cover, and we have the founder of BRICS Plus Analytics, Yaroslav Lisovolik, joining us live from Belgrade. A warm welcome to you. First of all, I take it that you might agree with the analysis you've just heard earlier, because you've been quoted as saying that BRICS is an organization that cannot be ignored. What do you mean by that?
Well, indeed, we've seen that a rising number of countries are applying to join BRICS, and BRICS is becoming one of the most dynamic platforms on the international stage. Indeed, more than 30 countries have expressed their willingness to join BRICS, and that, in a way, is really revealing the willingness on the part of a lot of the developing countries to pursue economic cooperation with a bloc that is greater in terms of its share of GDP, of global GDP, than the G7. These are economies that are amongst the fastest growing economies in the world. And so accordingly, there is interest on the part of a lot of the developing countries to develop economic ties with a bloc of economies that is growing quickly and at the same time has tremendous potential that is to be further realized through mutual cooperation, mutual economic cooperation, especially in areas such as trade and investment.
I want to ask you a bit more about that, particularly when it comes to looking at the new members that have joined since January. We've got UAE, Egypt, Iran, among others. What do they bring to the table for BRICS economic development? And what new countries do you think could or should join down the road, perhaps?
Well, this is indeed the issue of new members is probably the key focal point of this year's summit. And if there are decisions that may be adopted in the course of this year by BRICS, they most likely will relate to new members. The new members, such as Egypt, such as the UAE, they essentially further diversify the presence of BRICS in all of the main centers, regional parts of the global south. So essentially, after this expansion, we have a far greater representation of BRICS in Africa, with Ethiopia also being another member of the core of BRICS. And then, of course, the Middle East is also significantly now represented in the BRICS platform. So essentially now you have most of the regions of the global south being covered by BRICS, aside one important exception here would be Southeast Asia. And accordingly, a lot of the discussions in terms of new members were revolving around the possibility that some of the members of ASEAN could become next members of BRICS. This is an open question, but the key theme that is going to be discussed during the summit is who are the potential new members, and potential new members most likely will come from those economies that have already applied to join BRICS. And maybe some of the ASEAN countries that have applied, such as Malaysia, they may be discussed as potential new members of BRICS.
There has been some interest there. I want to ask about Russia because it's been, increasingly using the yuan to skirt Western sanctions. But does de-dollarization necessarily equate to yuanization?
Well, yuan is definitely being used more and more in trade amongst BRICS economies. And as national currencies now of BRICS economies account for most of the settlements, most of the transactions across BRICS economies, yuan is certainly accounts for the majority of these settlements and transactions. Yuan is the most prominent of all of the BRICS currencies on the international stage in terms of cross-border settlements. So this is no surprise that yuan is gaining prominence, and BRICS, you could say, is an important platform for that greater prominence of yuan to be expressed on the global arena. But at the same time, I don't think that the BRICS economies will be content with replacing one dependency on the dollar with the other dependency on the yuan. I think the interest will be precisely to focus on the use of all of the national currencies of BRICS to develop the mechanisms for these settlements. And one of the projects that has also been discussed in the past several years is a common currency to be developed by BRICS. This is not currently the key priority. This is something that is mostly discussed in the expert community. But potentially, if there is a common currency, that gives further optionality to BRICS economies to settle transactions. And ultimately, I think the key issue is greater optionality. No dependence on one or the other, but greater possibilities to use as many instruments as possible.
All right, understood. Want to leave it there for now, but thank you so much, Yaroslav Lisovolik, the founder of BRICS Plus Analytics, joining us live from Belgrade. Coming up on East Asia tonight, International Energy Agency Chief Fateh Birol shares his insights on global climate targets and the growth of renewables. Plus, gold moving ever closer to the psychological $3,000 mark with tensions in the Middle East and the U.S. election boosting demand. We'll keep you on top of the trading action. Business news next. And HSBC has announced an overhaul of the bank that would see it combine two of its biggest operations outside the UK and Hong Kong and restructure regionally. The move comes as the bank's new CEO looks to rein in costs against a backdrop of falling interest rates. Europe's largest bank by market value says it would streamline the bank into 4 business units. Starting from January the 1st next year, the company will restructure its operations into 4 distinct business lines: Hong Kong, UK, corporate and institutional banking, and international wealth and premier banking. The lender says the restructuring would help reduce duplication of processes and enhance decision-making. The bank, which employs about 214,000 people globally, has been removing duplicate roles for years and reducing its businesses in Western markets as it focuses on Asia and markets where it has scale. It has also been under pressure to trim costs to safeguard the company's margins as central banks around the world begin to cut interest rates. HSBC also announcing the appointment of Pam Kaur as Chief Financial Officer. HSBC's Hong Kong-listed shares closed nearly 0.4% lower, and the UK-listed stocks opening on the back foot. South Korea's Hyundai Motor had a lackluster Indian market debut after raising $3.3 billion in the country's biggest ever initial public offering. Its shares currently trading at 1,846 rupees. That's about 5.8% lower, as you can see there, than the issue price of 1,960 rupees, which was the top of the marketed range. The Hyundai India Motors IPO barely made it through the three-day window due to a lukewarm response from retail investors. The largest IPO in India was subscribed 2.37 times on the final day, with qualified institutional buyers coming to the rescue as the issue drew to a close. The IPO had valued Hyundai's India unit, the country's second largest car maker by sales, at about $19 billion, with the South Korean parent firm putting up 17.5% stake for purchase. Well, today's listing in Mumbai is Hyundai Motors' first such debut outside its home market of South Korea, and comes at a time when India's equity markets have risen sharply. But the tepid response to the listing underscores concerns over slowing auto demand in the country. The lackluster response weighing on parent Hyundai Motor in Seoul, which closed about 1% in the red. Indian automakers also feeling the pressure there. Shares of Mahindra, Tata Motors and Maruti Suzuki all taking a beating. Now, Asia's oldest subway, Tokyo Metro, is set to make its trading debut tomorrow in what would be Japan's largest listing in 6 years. Experts say the trading debut is set to support the bull case for the Japanese stock market after the heavily subscribed IPO. It was 15 times oversubscribed and raised $2.3 billion as investors were attracted by its reputation for safety and reliability. Foreign investors reportedly sought more than 35 times the amount of shares on offer to them. The IPO has been priced at 1,200 yen, the higher end of the forecast range. At that price range, Tokyo Metro's expected valuation will be $4.6 billion. The IPO follows a volatile period for Japanese stocks, caught up in the unwinding of a global carry trade, as well as increasing shareholder pressure that had pushed some companies to delist and conduct management buyouts. It is expected to further fuel a recovery for Asia's IPO market. The listing also comes at a time when rail travel in the country is experiencing a post-pandemic rebound. Let's take a quick look at equity markets in East Asia. They've been struggling since the open after a negative lead from Wall Street. And that's as traders try to assess the outlook for U.S. interest rates after comments from top Federal Reserve officials suggested they would like to see a slower pace of rate cuts. And that tempered hopes for another bumper cut at the bank's next meeting. Japan's Nikkei share average closed lower amid concerns that the ruling party may lose its lower house majority in the coming elections, while Wall Street's weak finish overnight also weighing on market sentiment. South Korea's benchmark are also closing more than 1% lower. TAIEX as well, ending the trading day in the red. Now, we're also tracking prices of gold as it moves ever closer to the psychological $3,000 mark after it hit more than 33 record highs so far this year. Geopolitical tensions, the tight U.S. presidential race, and a favorable macro backdrop have been attracting investors to the safe haven asset. It's pinned near record levels, up 0.6% at $2,735 an ounce. The head of the International Energy Agency flags a weaker Chinese economy and widespread EV adoption as two main reasons for expectations that global oil demand will peak by the end of the century. Fateh Birol shared his thoughts at Singapore International Energy Week, where urgent discussions are underway about the global transition to clean energy.
In fact, we are not saying that the oil demand will peak 2050, even earlier, by 2030. And the reason why we are going to see global oil demand to be weaker and peaking has nothing to do with climate change. There are two reasons, very simple two reasons. Reason number one is China, the largest oil importer of the world. In the last 10 years, more than 60% of global oil demand growth came from China only. So 60% China, 40% everybody, the rest of the world put together. But in the last 10 years, Chinese economy was very strong. It grew more than 6% per year, so needed a lot of energy to grow. And now, as everybody agrees, from Chinese Communist Party to the consultants or advisors in United States, in Europe, all the banks, Chinese economy is slowing down, which is very normal. So a slower economy needs less oil, and this is very obvious. This is number one. Number two reason is electric cars. Electric cars are growing everywhere. In China and in Europe, in North America, and this part of the world as well. And they are eating up from the growth of oil. So therefore, because of these two reasons, both of them are nothing driven by the climate change. One of them is technology, the other one is economic reason. We see global oil demand to slow down and a peak before 2030. And what is happening this now confirms and reconfirms our expectation. Look at the Middle East. One of the most difficult times in terms of geopolitics in the Middle East, the center of oil production and transportation, prices are still less than $70. In the past, when there's a strong demand growth period, 1/10 of this tension, what's happened in the Middle East, would have skyrocketed to oil prices. It is another confirmation that the oil demand is weakened. But this doesn't mean that we will not need oil anymore. Peaking oil means it will come to a certain level and we will still use oil, but the growth of oil after 2030 would be very difficult to see.
It's not so obvious, though, the reasons that you stated to the CEO of Saudi Aramco, who gave a keynote address yesterday here in the summit. Let's listen first to what he had to say.
Of course.
Most analysts agree that even when the growth in global oil demand stops at some point, no abrupt drop in overall demand is anticipated. And that stage is likely to be followed by a long plateau. So more than 100 million barrels per day would realistically still be required by 2050. This is a stark contrast with those predicting that oil will or must fall to just 25 million barrels per day by then.
So 100 million barrels per day still needed by 2050. What do you make of that?
So first of all, we listen now, but I was in the room yesterday, listened to the entire speech of the CEO of Saudi Aramco with great interest. I have a respect for his and other people's views, but I don't agree. I believe that the global oil demand will be weaker than today in 2050, lower than today, because of the new technologies coming in the market. We are seeing that where we use oil, for example, transportation sector is a key sector. It is going to be electrified. It has already started. In China today, 60% of all new car sales are electric cars. It is the next chapter of car manufacturing. It is coming. The buses is the same, the trucks, it will come. So I believe the oil demand in 2050 will be significantly less than today. But once again, it doesn't mean that it will be zero. We will still need some oil to be part of the global energy mix.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the expanding BRICS grouping and why Southeast Asian nations, Malaysia and Thailand, are keen to join. China carries out a live-firing exercise near Taiwan that Taipei says may be part of Beijing's so-called deterrence effect in the Taiwan Strait. South Korea may consider directly supplying weapons to Ukraine after it accused North Korea of sending troops to fight for Russia. Seoul is also looking at sending personnel to Ukraine to monitor Pyongyang's troops. President Vladimir Putin hosts leaders of the BRICS nations that make up more than a quarter of the world's economy in a high-profile summit to demonstrate the failure of Western attempts to isolate Russia. We did discuss the BRICS Summit a little earlier with Sadanand Doom, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute. Now, he says the BRICS group not just incoherent, but also divided.
I personally think that the BRICS is at a very interesting moment. It has expanded from its traditional 5 members by adding another 5. Now it's a 10-member grouping, and it may look to expand further in the coming years. My own view is that it is basically quite an incoherent grouping for a couple of reasons. One is that there's nothing really that binds all these countries together except for the fact that they are non-Western. And the second is that, there's a very sharp divide between countries in the BRICS that are overtly anti-Western. I mean Russia, I mean Iran, I mean China under Xi Jinping, and countries that are non-Western but not anti-Western. And the biggest example of that would be India. So I think that when you sort of look at if you look at the disposition of these countries, you're going to have some countries that would like to take a kind of stronger stance that is in direct opposition to the West. And then you have other countries that are more interested in economic cooperation and not really interested in turning the BRICS into a kind of anti-Western bloc.
Also of interest at this year's BRICS Summit are new potential members from Southeast Asia. Reports indicate Malaysia and Thailand may be accepted into the bloc. Now, Thailand submitted its application in June and Malaysia followed suit a month later. Dr. Oi San from the Singapore Institute of International Affairs discusses the possible motivation for joining the group.
Well, I think the main reason is to explore and to open up potential new markets, especially from the global south, to try to explore markets such as Brazil, such as South Africa, and many other countries which have since joined BRICS in order for example, Malaysia semiconductors, for some of Thailand's automobiles and so forth. And then there's also this thing about, shall we say, spreading the risk a little bit, because this grouping of BRICS country, they are talking about de-dollarizations, of not using dollars anymore in settlements of international trade. And if that were to take place, then countries like Malaysia and Thailand, well, they have already been, shall we say, extending one leg on the other ship. So they would be less impacted. And then the last reason, for example, I think the elephant in the room would be China, which is leading this BRICS bloc. And it's also a means of endearing countries such as Malaysia and Thailand even more to China, with the hope that China will invest more in these countries.
China has held a live-fire exercise near Taiwan days after Chinese President Xi Jinping called on troops to prepare for war. China's Maritime Safety Administration in Bintan has said the gunfiring would take place in a limited area close to the mainland, just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan. Bintan is the closest point in mainland China to Taiwan's main island. In response, Taiwan said it is monitoring China's military activities and intentions. The Defense Ministry said the exercises could be part of Beijing stepping up its intimidation in the Taiwan Strait. Earlier this month, China held a major military exercise that sent a record number of aircraft, warships and Coast Guard vessels to waters surrounding Taiwan. Beijing said it was a stern warning to what it called Taiwan Independence Forces. After the drills, Chinese state media said President Xi Jinping visited a military rocket force and told them to strengthen their readiness for war. Now, over the weekend, U.S. and Canadian warships also sailed through the Taiwan Strait in what the U.S. called a routine freedom of navigation transit. China condemned their actions, accusing them of disrupting peace and stability in the region. China has confirmed it reached an agreement with India to resolve the years-long border conflict between both nations. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says it is in close communication with New Delhi through diplomatic and military channels and will work together to implement the solution. India on Monday announced the breakthrough to de-escalate tensions along the Himalayan border it shares with China. New Delhi says the two countries have agreed on a patrolling agreement along the disputed frontier. Details remain scant, but India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar says the agreement returns the status quo in the Himalayas to 2020, ending the long-drawn standoff between the two militaries. The country's foreign secretary attributed the breakthrough to intense diplomacy between officials from both sides.
Now, as a result of the discussions that have taken place over the last several weeks, an agreement has been arrived at on patrolling arrangements along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas. And this is leading to disengagement and eventually a resolution of the issues that had arisen in these areas in 2020.
Tensions escalated into violence in 2020 when China objected to Indian infrastructure projects in the disputed region. Both sides clashed in the Gawan River Valley, with troops engaging in hand-to-hand combat using knives and clubs as firearms and explosives were restricted in the area. More than 20 deaths were reported in total, marking the most serious fatal confrontation between the two militaries since 1975. The incident strained ties for years and led to the deployment of more troops and military equipment along the 3,400-kilometre-long border. Since then, several rounds of high-level talks have been held in a bid to defuse tensions. Australia has sealed a multi-billion-dollar deal with the US to bolster its air and missile defences. And that's in the face of what Defence Minister Richard Marles has called the most complex geostrategic environment since the Second World War. Canberra will spend $4.7 billion to acquire Raytheon-made medium and long-range missiles. Now, they can be fired from land or ship and are capable of targeting and destroying aircraft or other missiles in midair. Mr. Marles described the arms as the most advanced air and missile defence weapons in the world. They will be progressively deployed across the country's 3 Hobart-class destroyers and planned Hunter-class anti-submarine frigates. Mr. Marles says the investment is needed to defend Australia's national interests amid the escalating military tensions in the Asia-Pacific. Australia unveiled a boost in its defence spending earlier this year to better prepare itself against China's so-called coercive tactics in the region. Besides developing its surface fleet, Australia plans to deploy nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS tripartite agreement with the US and the UK. Now, the news, Texas consistently ranking as one of the hardest states in the US to register or cast a ballot in. But this year, it's more onerous and legally risky than ever. Texas, along with at least 29 other states, has enacted stricter voting laws, some of which are already having an impact on minority groups. Tony Waterman has more.
So what are we looking at right here?
These are voter registration cards that have been mailed to my house.
When Lena Prado received these voter registration forms in the mail, it raised a few red flags. Not only has she been registered to vote since 2010, she hadn't moved, and she's running for a commissioner seat in San Antonio, a major clue she's already on the voting block.
Had you ever received a voter registration application before this year?
No, I have not.
So something's changed.
Something's changed.
Lena, a Republican, believes that something is political. For the first time ever, Democratic officials in her county have hired an outside company that she believes is liberal-leaning to mail out voter registration forms, whether they've been requested or not. This is in addition to forms already being mailed out by local Republican and Democrat organizations.
I feel like it's going to drive a lot of confusion. They're probably going to say, oh, well, if I received it, it's because I have to take an action. And is this going to make the system make a backlog, which we already have in our area? We have a backlog of over 4,000 registrations that have not been vetted yet.
That backlog, Lena worries, could overwhelm the vetting process, letting irregularities slip through the cracks and cause delays on Election Day if someone isn't registered correctly. Texas's Republican leadership has also zeroed in on the potential for election fraud, suing over the forms claiming they could invite felons and non-citizens to vote.
Research repeatedly shows that election fraud is exceedingly rare in the United States, just a tiny fraction of 1%, far too small to move any election in one direction or the other. But the idea that fraud is rampant has taken hold, particularly among Republicans. Polls show that the vast majority of them believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump and that this election is primed for fraud.
That fear persists despite a slew of new voting laws meant to safeguard American elections. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, at least 30 states have passed new restrictions since the 2020 elections, many of them limiting mail-in and absentee voting.
If you keep on telling people that elections are stolen, that elections aren't fair, they're not honest, then they're going to believe you after a while. I think much of the actions that the state takes is to convince their base that they're doing something about a problem that probably they know doesn't exist, but they created the impression that it existed, and if they don't do something about that, they will lose turnout.
Here in Texas, new ID requirements for mail-in voting led to more than 24,000 ballots being thrown out during the 2022 midterm primaries. And according to the Brennan Center, the applications and ballots of Latino, Asian, and Black voters were rejected at higher rates than white voters. The state has also banned drive-through and 24-hour voting, options Democrats say are popular with Black voters, whose work shifts or family responsibilities may make it tougher to vote during traditional polling hour. And those convicted of voting illegally now face up to 20 years in prison. Critics say that could have a chilling effect on voter outreach and education efforts, and disproportionately affect people of color and other minority groups. But state authorities deny these stringent measures are aimed at discouraging these groups from voting.
Texas is very simply making it easier to vote and harder to cheat.
But while new laws may make voting more difficult for some, dozens of states have made it more accessible, expanding in-person early voting, simplifying verification requirements, and making it easier to register to vote.
From the perspective of voters, I don't think they're going to see a lot of impact from the kind of intense partisan infighting that has been happening. I think actually for all of the talk, almost every voter is going to find a safe and convenient experience.
The question is whether that safe experience holds after the results come in. Tony Waterman, CNA, San Antonio, Texas.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, researchers in Taiwan are investigating why more whales are washing up on their shores. My producers wanted me to sing this, but I'm just going to ask, are you lonesome tonight? Well, how about a chat with this AI robot, one of many offerings at Japan's biggest tech show? Researchers say whales and dolphins have been washing up on Taiwan's shores in record numbers, with more than 100 every year. And less than a third of them were found alive. CNA's No Ordinary Rescue documentary series followed people who are doing all they can to return these creatures to the ocean.
野生动物不会随意搁浅在一个陌生的沙滩上，特别是它一辈子都生活在海中，它一定是在不得已的情况下，这个不得已的情况下就是它已经没有体力了，它只好跟着海浪搁浅在沙滩上。5月中的时候，就有遇到一只在宜兰搁浅的小抹香鲸，那时候是一个活体的搁浅事件。那个搁浅事件后来通报给我们的时候，协会的兽医到现场。
那我们到场去做检查的时候，发现它非常的消瘦，然后再来是它的呼吸蛮虚弱的，而且喷出很多的泡沫，那代表说它可能有呛了不少的水，然后再加上心跳偏微弱，所以代表这一只可能有就是一定程度的心脏的问题、循环的问题，还有呼吸相关的问题。那再加上它对人非常的紧张，在那么紧张的状况下很难恢复健康，对，所以这只也是一个没办法收容的个体，所以我们选择做人道处置，然后我们做更仔细的解剖，了解它的搁浅的原因。
就要换刀片哦，它的皮还有病。这一只的皮很难切，所以刀片会需要一直换。
这是寄生虫吗？
寄生虫吗？这么多吗？
对。
今天晚上做的解剖的话，其实是做皮肤的采样。那明天的话，我们会做更仔细的解剖，就包含说它的内脏的长相，看哪个脏器是有病变的。其实这部分就有点像法医啦，就是我们看它是因为生病了，还是因为一些意外而死亡。
协会最重要的目标就是我们在做鲸豚海龟的搁浅救援，在做救援同时，因为我们也需要了解它才可以做救援，所以在海上调查跟教育训练的话也是非常重要的，就是要先了解动物，我们才可以好好的救治它、保育它们。
Well, you can catch all the action in the full episode of No Ordinary Rescue on CNA.Asia, MeWatch, or YouTube. From robots easing loneliness to smart glasses that can translate languages in real time, Japan's tech companies are using AI to change the way people live and work. They came out in force at Japan's biggest tech show, CTEC, last week.
AI is no longer just a concept for the future. It's being incorporated into everything today. Japan's top companies are showing how integrating AI into their latest tech can change the way we live and work.
これからは AI を導入するかしないかではなく AI とどのように向き合い活用していくのか課題解決にどう生かしていくのかが求められるまさに新しい時代に突入したと言っても過言ではないと思います。
One of the major highlights at CTEC this year is Romi, a conversational AI robot developed by Maxi Inc. Romi interacts with users through daily conversations and learns their habits over time. Its purpose is more than just small talk. Romi is designed to tackle real social issues, especially in Japan's aging society.
いろんなところで社会課題を解決したいと、そういうふうに考えております。特に今の文脈だと結構強めなのはやっぱりご高齢の方とかがですね、遠方に住んでいて、そういったところの孤独だったりとか不安というところをですね、ロミで解消していくというところはすごく大きな課題だと認識しておりまして、そういったところをも踏まえてですね、抑えていきたいです。
Romi's makers say it can observe what users are doing, like what they're eating, and respond accordingly. OpenAI's influence is hard to miss at this year's CTEC. The company has rapidly expanded in Japan with the aim of making AI more accessible and impactful across industries.
なぜ日本なのか、なぜアジアの中で日本なのかということをよく聞かれます、お客様に。これいくつか理由があるんですが、一つはですね、チャット GPT といわれるサービス、これをですね、日本の方にたくさんご利用いただいております。これは英語圏以外でのですね、利用例としては非常に日本人の方々にご利用いただいている一つございます。
But AI isn't limited to robots. US-based company Solos has on display smart glasses that do real-time language translations.
We have integrated AI features like ChatGPT, we call it Solo Chat, and translation, we call Solo Translate. Actually, we can support 25 different languages for translations.
Japanese electronics giant Sharp is also leading the charge towards wearable tech. Their AI-powered device called Sound Partner lets users control home appliances simply by speaking out loud.
シャープでは AIoT 家電といいまして、1000機種以上の家電を AIoT 化しております。で、その中でこういったサウンドパートナーというウェアラブルを使って AI と会話をしながら制御を行ったりですとか、会話をしてレシピを決めたりですとか、そういった形で家事を行うということをご提案しております。
The message at CTEC is clear. AI is not just a buzzword, but a tool that can pave the way for a more connected and efficient future.
Some ideas for your Christmas stocking this year. That's it for East Asia Tonight this Tuesday. Thank you so much for watching.